Welcome to Slimehouse, a podcast defining a genre of crude humor, outrageous hijinks, and mild language. A short while back, we heard about a new documentary coming out called The Orange Years, the Nickelodeon story, and we knew we'd have to cover it on this show. Today, we're interviewing documentary directors Scott Barber and Adam Sweeney about their inspiration and process for making a definitive history of how Nick became what we know it to be, and the shows and creators that brought it there. It's a great conversation with remarkable insight. After listening, be sure to check out The Orange Years, which is now available on VOD on all major platforms for a comprehensive look down a slime-filled memory lane. Enjoy!
So we wanted to get a little bit more on the genesis of this project. Did y'all watch a lot of Nickelodeon or Pinwheel when you were younger? And if so, what properties really spoke to you the most and were you most excited to cover?
So yeah, we grew up definitely watching Nickelodeon. Scott and I have known each other since fourth grade. We became best friends whenever we were in sixth grade, and we watched Nickelodeon. We were aware of Pinwheel. You Can't Do It on Television. The entire lineup we watched. And so in addition to that, the project kind of became a genesis and started really from the times like we both grew up in broken homes. And when I moved away, we stayed friends by watching Snick and watching all these shows together, and we'd be on the phone all the time calling each other. And so with respect to the shows that we love and the ones that we were most excited about, I think you can name any of them, honestly. Like I know I was excited about Are You Afraid of the Dark? The Adventures of Pete and Pete, Clarissa Explains It All, Double Dare, The Secret World of Alex Mack. I mean, you could just go on, right? And that's the beauty of Nickelodeon, is that you have, you could do a top 100 and probably realistically, like in terms of shows, and probably like number 100 would be just as good as number one, right? You could just change them or interweave them. So that was kind of my experience of it, and we kind of say that it was a documentary that has been a childhood in the making.
Nice. Going into getting started on the project itself, I imagine once you were underway, you had a lot of material to rewatch in preparation for the documentary specifically. So, and probably stuff that maybe was before your time or that just wasn't something you'd watched. So just tell us about your process of archival watching and figuring out how to get that into the final cut.
We had to watch a lot of shows, and Adam and I are kind of 80s and 90s kids. So luckily we kind of straddled this whole time period that we were covering, but there was definitely some time before, like one thing that they referred to as the green vegetables years, which was before the orange logo became a thing. And when the network was just known as Pinwheel, we didn't know about that. Neither of our families had cable back then. Mm-hmm. And then there was some of the later shows Adam and I were kind of aging out of by then. So kind of at the era that we're covering, which is really Geraldine Laybourne's tenure at Nickelodeon, some of the early stuff before she came on and the later stuff, we had to do some research. And that was fun too, because, we had passion for all these shows, but it was cool to learn about new things that we didn't really have a like nostalgia button for. We were just getting to be journalists and learn about something new.
Yeah, and there was definitely footage that we talked about whenever we were looking back at Cube and Pinwheel, that whenever we were like kind of archiving it, that we were just blown away by. There's one scene in it where Scott and I just couldn't stop just cracking up at the idea. I mean, it was kind of like some of the stuff that they did was really cool because it was like interactive television, which happens now realistically on Netflix. I think there was the Dark Mirror episode where it was like a choose your own adventure kind of, right? And so even whenever the things weren't working for them, they were still cutting edge and had great ideas. People were just weren't ready for it yet. So yeah, the archival footage, there was so much of it, and the way that we went about getting it, credit to the team and credit to Scott, like was any way possible. Like he is going to YouTube, going to hit people up in their DMs like that were just big fans, and we asked, like, do you have footage? Do you have, like, did you go to Nickelodeon? We put a call out, like, did you guys ever go to Universal Studios? Did you go do this and this? If so, do you have any type of footage whatsoever? Vulcan Video in Austin helped us out a ton because they had a bunch of DVDs and other things that didn't, that just weren't available at large. And then also, sometimes you have to go to eBay or go onto Amazon and buy, like we had to go and, I think it was, we had to buy the Magic Johnson Nick News special. That is something that just isn't readily available either. So, it was like whatever it took, it was a matter of hunting it down. And so it was educational. The entire thing was educational for us the entire time.
Yeah, I work often as an assistant editor, and I love archival projects for that reason. So I can see how that process is great. So
yeah.
Is there anything specifically that, and if you can't speak to this, all good. Is there anything specifically that you were, one, really excited to find that may have been kind of lost, and then two, things that you maybe couldn't find or had to leave on the cutting room floor that don't necessarily appear in the documentary?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there is, we talk, without going too much into it, but we do talk about Nick News and how important it was at the time. And Nickelodeon still does it. They still do, like the Kids Pick Your President, and they do other items like that. And I was reading the other day that I think the Nickelodeon Kids Pick Your President website got hacked somehow. And it's like, I don't know if people understand that, but those votes don't count. So whoever was doing that, good try. But so at least the kids are getting kind of a real idea into what happens in terms of political interference, I guess. But so the Nick News section I thought was very, I think that it's an example that this film hopefully is not empty calories, and that it has a true, spirit and a true heart. A couple of things, and Scott and I have talked about it a little bit. Scott brought this up a couple days ago that I kind of forgot about is, we did have a section on Nick at Night that was really cool, and that we wish that we would have talked about that also. Scott can speak about that a little bit more, but it speaks to the ability both as like really smart marketers, but also the intelligence of Nickelodeon, that they realized that the reality is that parents were kids too once.
Yeah, there was a whole beginning section that I didn't know about, that I had to learn about, where there was this old technology called Cube that Nickelodeon started as a channel on that. And I was fascinated by that, just because I didn't even know that was a thing. It was only available in Columbus, Ohio. And for any fans of kind of quirky 80s, 70s, and 80s technology, I think they'll really get a kick out of that part. I think we could have made a whole documentary just on Cube. I don't know who would watch it, but it was so cool. And the people, we reached out to some of the people that worked on Cube, and they gave us so much archival footage. So that helped out so much. So we were able to really make this fun little chapter because we had all this archival footage to help support the interviews.
Yeah, those early sections were really fascinating to me. And it's cool that you bring up the kind of 70s, 80s gadgetry, because especially the pinwheel kind of animation, it was like puppetry, but it had this kind of oil painted style that, immediately brought me back. And, I wish, great animation is still out there, and if you seek it out, but just that kind of innovative, I feel like is missing a lot nowadays.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, as good as the animation is on, Nickelodeon and also other, just major networks, a lot of it really is. I mean, the truth is that a lot of entertainment is a copycat industry, right? And it doesn't always pay sometimes it does, but to take risks, and I think at that point in time, people hadn't figured it out. And so it's like when you kind of go back and you look at like the Wright brothers and all of like the way that people were trying to create planes, you're just like, that is just, how would that even possibly work, right? But some of them are fascinating, and some of them, like you think look cooler in some ways than what actually ended up being the trend, So yeah, so I understand what you're saying.
So one thing we want to talk about is the decline of the children's game show, which is depicted in your movie. Well, not the decline, but the rise of it with Nick Arcade, Double Dare, Legends of Hidden Temple. That doesn't really exist anymore, despite the recent revival and popularity of primetime game shows such as Family Feud. Do you think about that, or why that might have happened? With like the advent of YouTube, perhaps.
I mean, I can only speak from what I think is going on, and I think that there's just less of an emphasis on having knowledge in your brain. It's not as impressive as it used to be, because if you're sitting around back in the 80s and you're talking about a subject and you don't know, you can't really insert yourself in the conversation. If it's like, who is the actor that starred in that? If there's one person in your group that can be like, oh, that was actually this person, that was impressive. Whereas now we're not impressed by that because we can all just look it up on our phones and find out who it is. So I really feel like kids these days, and again, this is purely anecdotal, purely my theory, is that it's just because kids aren't impressed with that anymore, because knowing things is something that they have at their fingertips. Because yeah, I mean, they revived Double Dare, and it was just like the old Double Dare, even better. It was awesome. But for some reason, it only lasted a couple of seasons. It came and went. So that's my best guess personally.
I think also that we kind of exist in an era where competition is a little bit frowned upon amongst children, like, I mean, and, like I remember doing an article when I was in college, or writing an article about like the psychology of everybody getting awards, and I think that kind of, to a degree, is where we're at realistically. I think that I mean, everybody is special in their own way, right? But the fact is, there are winners and then there are losers. That's just how it is, right? And the thing, and I wish that we could go back to, I mean, they did do another Double Dare, right? But I know what you're talking about, like with respect to, I would love to see like a Nick Arcade type, like esports competition. That'd be a lot of fun, right? I mean, because that is something worldwide that people can connect to. It also seems like you would have tons of gamers and tons of gaming companies that would be interested in that. I mean, so that's, I mean, I can't speak on it, but I mean, I think that, I agree with what Scott said also, is that knowledge, unless you're doing like geeks who drink, right, or something like that, like pub quizzes, which were from that generation, you're encouraged to know that. Whereas now I think it's more, you're encouraged to share your personality, right? Like it's about kind of feeding your ego a little bit, like I've talked to a couple people that I work with, they're like, I'm an influencer. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, I guess technically everybody can say that they're an influencer, and some are, don't get me wrong. Like there are a lot of people that are very good at what they do, but it's almost become kind of like, it's just kind of, it doesn't mean anything anymore, really, right? Like anybody can say that. And so I wish that, that we would place an emphasis on being more active, on being more knowledgeable, because those are things that will serve you well, right? And it also just makes you, there's a reason we go to college, is that it makes you just a more cultured and more empathetic and understanding human being, So I think it's cool that y'all picked up about that and that y'all talk about it, right? Because it's a gap right now that exists in children's programming. Like, remember like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego?
Mm-hmm.
Like
All-time favorite.
That one was awesome. Like Scott and I used to always joke around and always say like, hit it rockapella. Like it was like, why was there a band? Like, why was rockapella there just hanging out? But it's
so good.
What'd you say?
I said so good.
I
Rockapella
thought you
is so
said
good.
I thought you said because they could, and I was like,
Because they
you're
could.
right.
Yeah,
You're right.
that's true. They could, and they did.
But yeah, you know, those types of games, I loved watching them, and Nickelodeon was synonymous with them. You know, they had them all the time. So yeah.
Well, it's funny because I mean, one of the reasons the three of us became good friends is because we all, in a lot of ways, are trivia and movie history and sort of have a lot of data and interest in that just, I think that's one of the ways we all kind of connected and found common ground. But I agree that in the kind of iPhone era, that's a lost kind of needed thing because you have it immediately there. And even just film history and kind of, yeah, film history, I feel like is also a lost form because you can't keep up with what's current now that, you know, why would you go back and watch the others? And that makes me realize we haven't asked, how did this project, for like jumping to the beginning of the filmmaking, like what's the inception of this film and how did you both just say, reach a point where you could do it and say, yep, let's go make it?
Adam and I had been a screenwriting duo before this. We had written scripts and just kind of go about starting a film career that way. And it was, it was fun. It was rewarding, but we really wanted to make a film where we could be involved in all aspects of the filmmaking. So we could make sure it was completed and also that it was completed in the way that we wanted to. You know, we really wanted to be involved in it all the way through. So we thought maybe a documentary, that felt like something that was accessible to us. And around the same time in our professional day job career, we were kind of working on these documentaries for big companies. And so we kind of said, we're kind of making documentaries already. We know how to do it. We know how to frame up an interview. We know how to edit. And we, most importantly, from our days writing scripts, we know how to tell a story. Mm-hmm. So we can do it. We can do a documentary. I remember us saying it, we can do this. And so we just started thinking, okay, well, if we do a documentary, what do we do a documentary about? And we had maybe 3 or 4 ideas. We were kicking around. We were kind of waiting for one to kind of appear as the standout. And, Nickelodeon was one that we kept kind of bouncing around, Nickelodeon. And then we said, well, what would that look like? A Nickelodeon documentary? How could you tell a story? What's your through line? How could you make it concise and not just be nostalgia, not just be a walk down memory lane? And it was once we started doing some research and we found out about the work of the great Jerry Laybourne, who, for those that don't know, was the president all throughout the 80s and 90s and all the way from early shows like You Can't Do That on Television, all the way to shows like All That and Kenan and Kel. She was responsible for that, all of that. That's insane. And once we found out about her and her team of just crazy, groundbreaking people, that's when we knew there was actually a story there. And that's when we really, beyond the nostalgia, when we found out about her, that's when we got really passionate about it and said, okay, yeah, this is a story that needs to be made, that people need to hear about. And that's when we got excited. And that's kind of when The Orange Years was born.
Awesome.
Yeah, one of my kind of big epiphanies from this movie, and I guess kind of one of the larger epiphanies we've had as we've been doing this podcast, looking back at a lot of these 80s, 90s, kind of thousands family-oriented movies, is that a lot of these movies are really successful because they didn't talk down to kids. They spoke with kids. They weren't condescending. It felt like they were written by, younger people, even though they were written by older folks. So kind of how did that influence the storytelling of your guys' documentary? How did you guys kind of mold your tone in that spirit of being fun and youthful, but also, as you just mentioned, being knowledgeable?
I think that's a great question. And I think that we always, one thing that I think is important for those types of films and those types of stories from the 80s to now, but definitely 80s, 90s, and 2000s, is that they have a level of respect for the story and for all the characters, right? So I think about a movie like E.T., and that movie is all about empathizing with what Elliot is going through. Even the parents, they talk to him, even the guy who's the bad guy, right, who's like the government, you know, like kind of scientist guy, talks to him, right, and he's very kind to him. So I think that what we wanted to do was emulate that level of respect, and also make sure, just like Nickelodeon did, that whenever there was just an energy there, right? And so you want to match that in the score. You want to match that from the very beginning, right? Like the way that it was edited, you know. And a lot of credit goes to Scott and Sean and Brad, the key editors for that. Is that we wanted to make sure that from the beginning that you jump in and that we're going at a little bit of a fast pace, right? So that can get you back into that mindset, right? Of like, this is what Nickelodeon was. Like, it was like fast and it was upbeat and it was this and this, right? But then we also wanted to make sure that we had one person behind the camera, one person in front of the camera. Scott talks about this a lot, about so that we had somebody that you knew, that you loved, that you could connect with, but then you also had the adult who was there as well, right? Who was telling the story. And I think that always kind of gave us the fact that we felt a responsibility to, and let's be realistic, pressure to do this the right way. I think that helped us. And furthermore, we had hundreds of different programs that, while all very different, all had that same spirit, right? So we could kind of emulate that, right? And hopefully it's a little bit different, all due respect to The Force Awakens, right? But like The Force Awakens tonally knows what it needed to do, right? Like J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan knew what they needed to do because they had the blueprint right there, right? So that helped out. I think that helped us out a lot in terms of having a little bit of a North Star of how we needed to focus on tone.
I think for me too, it was like once, because I kind of come from like a rock and roll kind of background, and it was like once we found out like the DIY spirit and the kind of like FU attitude of Nickelodeon, it was so punk rock that it was like, oh yeah, this can kind of have this punk energy. That's when it was like, okay, yeah, that made it a lot more. It just kind of made the whole thing kind of made sense all at once. So we tried to do that, keep that energy up and emulate that energy. So yeah, it was a blast to get to edit this thing.
I like that comparison to kind of punk rock. I kind of had that same thought myself, just kind of like childlike anarchy. But also one of the things that really spoke to me was the section on Clarissa Explains It All, which I really liked as a kid. But I didn't really process how progressive it was for the time. So something for me was just kind of, as I was watching, reflecting back on like, oh, well, like what lessons did I may have, unknowingly, unconsciously learned from Nickelodeon. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of things that in revisiting a lot of these shows, maybe you kind of reflected on as, oh, wow, this was a very formative lesson that I learned from this.
Well, I think some of it too is what you just said. It shows their understanding of kids in that they were teaching you a lesson and you didn't even know it. Like it was so progressive, but you weren't watching the show going, wow, this is so progressive. I mean, granted, you're a kid, so you probably wouldn't think like that anyway, but they had all these groundbreaking shows and it never felt like they were preaching to you or they were talking to you like, hey kids, it's time to learn a lesson. But Clarissa Explains It All was definitely a progressive show, and it definitely opened up a different world for, we hadn't seen girls and females portrayed like that up until that point. They were always portrayed in kind of a pedantic kind of manner, and they weren't. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of shows that looking back, I was like, oh wow, this was really teaching you to have empathy. A lot of the bullies on Nickelodeon shows, you would learn why they were bullies. They weren't just bullies because they were a one-note antagonist. Bobby Budnick on Salute Your Shorts. There's a whole episode where you find out why he is the way that he is. And funny enough, Danny Cooksey also played Stoop Kid on Hey Arnold, and you find out about him. Isn't that funny? Yeah.
I did not know that.
I think that I learned a lot of lessons, and I think the beauty of Nickelodeon was that I didn't know that I was learning them, and that shows you how well they knew how to talk to kids and how much they understood kids, that they could actually speak to them in their language.
Yeah, I think you don't have to have a shirt that says the Force is female all the time. I mean, I think that like it's okay to, I mean, and absolutely, right? Like gender racial representation matter, right? They matter now more than ever. But there's a difference between using those topics for exploitative purposes to make money, and then just to actually do it, right, and to stand for it. And I remember learning lessons, and in hindsight, I was thinking about this, these last couple of weeks since Halloween, is the Adventures of Pete and Pete. There's an episode, the Halloweeny episode, and it's all about little Pete wants to break the record for most houses trick-or-treated at, right? The neighborhood record, or I think the world record. And his older brother is growing up, and he's to the point where he wants to do it, but he's afraid of being picked on by his friend, or not his friends, but by peers and bullies, right? So they're always like, hey, listen, you don't want to be a Halloweeny, do you? And they bully him and they'll beat him up. And so at that time, I was, almost realistically coming into that era, and my brother was 6 years younger than me. And so I forgot that I had like an actual moment where I went trick-or-treating with him. And I think that I was probably inspired by the fact that the lesson of that is that you need to support your family, and you need to care about other people's dreams more than your dreams sometimes, right? And those things are just built in. And it's not like, as much as I love South Park, and so many people love South Park, there was no lesson of the day, right? It was just like Scott said, it was baked in, and they found a way to do it in a very poignant manner that didn't feel like it was hitting you over the head with the message.
That actually kind of gets into what I was going to ask. My introduction to Nickelodeon was some of the cartoons they came out with in the mid to late 90s, such as Cat Dog and Hey Arnold. So I kind of wanted to know what you guys thought about Nick's relationship to other TV channels at the time. I think in the doc you talk a lot about how like they're kind of the anti-Disney, but I was thinking more about two other channels in particular. One of which is, I think you guys talked about a little bit, but MTV. And I always thought growing up that MTV and Nickelodeon were kind of, partially because they both made their like movie tie-ins with Paramount, but like they were kind of like, they kind of were like a little and older brother to each other in terms of the content they were making, because there were also cartoons on MTV like Beavis and Butthead, but then also Cartoon Network, because I would watch shows on Cartoon Network that felt like they had a Nickelodeon energy to it, Ed, Edd and Eddy in particular. So I was wondering if like you guys think about what sets Nickelodeon apart, or kind of like that.
Well, so Scott, do you want me to talk about MTV real quick, and then you can talk about Cartoon Network? Or
yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay. So Viacom owns MTV and Nickelodeon.
Yeah.
And so some of the, like, for example, like Fred Seibert and Alan Goodman, they created the MTV logos and a lot of the MTV bumpers, and they ended up coming to Nickelodeon and working on a lot of the branding. So it makes total sense that they would, feel like spiritual siblings to a degree. Yeah. Ren and Stimpy was on both channels, which says a lot about Ren and Stimpy, like how like really naughty and irreverent it was. But I think that that's a really fair comparison, and I think that it was almost like once you graduated from Nickelodeon, you moved on to MTV.
Yeah.
Right. It was like you were going to like pop culture college, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that that's definitely a fair comparison. And I think that it's awesome, like, that you would pick up on it.
Yeah. As far as Cartoon Network goes, I think that they have a really great relationship. I think both made a bunch of really awesome cartoons and still do. I think that, Nickelodeon opened the door for Cartoon Network. Before Nickelodeon, cartoons were only Saturday mornings. Mm-hmm. And that's it, and Nickelodeon was the one that said, we're going to make kids programming, not just Saturday mornings, but all the time. And then Cartoon Network took it a step further and said, we're going to make cartoons all the time. And those first 3 Nicktoons, I mean, they were so incredibly revolutionary, you know, and I didn't really know that growing up. I kind of took it for granted. But, you know, before that, cartoons were just commercials for toys. And there was a lot of great cartoons that happened, you know, back in the early days of Looney Tunes. And then it got really stale for a long time. And Nickelodeon brought that back with Doug, Rugrats, and Ren and Stimpy. That's the whole idea of it being creator run, creator driven, story driven, and not merchandise driven. You know, it's a lot easier to watch an episode of Doug than it is to watch an episode of like Transformers, as much as I loved Transformers when I was a little kid. So I think that a lot of the stuff that happened on Cartoon Network, it was fantastic, but I think it owes everything to Vanessa Coffey, who was the pioneer of those first 3 Nicktoons. So I think that's almost maybe like a parent and sibling relationship between Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network.
Right on.
My next question is about tropes, because that's something we talk a lot about in our show, is the things that come back. And I think one of my very favorite moments of the doc is when you're talking about Hey Dude, and you say, oh, when in doubt, we just threw him in the trough, and they show like 4 or 5 clips of that gag. And I love that, because I think those are the kind of things that you don't see when you're only watching an isolated show or episode. But when you watch a whole bunch, you start to see all these familiarities. And so I wanted to just kind of ask you in general about tropes that you uncovered and tropes that you like or you're familiar with, et cetera.
There was one trope that I didn't notice as a kid, but I noticed when I was editing the doc. And that is that on a common theme on all of these Nickelodeon shows is that the kids are really smart and the adults are absolute idiots. They're buffoons, you know, and that started with You Can't Do That on Television. But then you think Salute Your Shorts. Camp counselor Ugg Lee was an idiot. on Hey Dude, Mr. Ernst, he was lovable, but he was kind of a buffoon, because that's how kids feel. When kids look at adults, they just think they're so dumb. And I think that's a common theme, even on the shows that Nickelodeon bought, because, you know, Nickelodeon had to purchase the rights to shows in the early days. They weren't, before they were making their own programming, you know, shows like Inspector Gadget, you know, Penny was really smart and she was the one that always solved the crime. Inspector Gadget was just kind of there to take the credit. And that followed through into the Nicktoons. You know, the parents on Rugrats were always kind of stupid. They always followed that Dr. Lipschitz, who was, I think that name is hilarious, but was always giving them horrible advice and they were always taking it. So yeah, that was one trope that we kind of uncovered that I never thought of as a kid, but I was like, yeah, that's true. They made all the adults were idiots. And that is really how kids feel. So I thought that was cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think also that they I mean, some of the tropes are tropes that have been from the beginning of filmmaking, really, right? When you think about like the Abbott Costellos, the Laurel and Hardys, there's the straight man, and then there's like kind of the physical, you know what I mean? Like generally it's like a physically different looking person, and also somebody that's more of a slapstick, but they also had a way to flip those, right? Is generally like with, you know, like Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy to a degree, and the Three Stooges, a lot of times I would say like the tall, like the slender person was the one that was like, seen as like, oh, they're the smart one. They have it all figured out, right? But the reality is, like, when you look at Kenan and Kel, it was the exact opposite. Now, like Kenan's character didn't have it all figured out, but he was the one that was, you know, pulling, it was kind of like reining in Kel all the time. And so I thought that was really cool, because you could go back and watch these icons, like these comedic legends, and then see where a lot of Nickelodeon stories look at Drake and Josh, right? Drake and Josh essentially is the same thing as Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Kenan and Kel. Like they're all very similar and they all work.
Yeah, I really like that. I hadn't put it all together that way, but now it seems so obvious in hindsight. So that's really cool.
I'm not sure that I had thought about it before this moment either. So
yeah, well, that's why it's good to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, one of the first things kind of we thought of too when we were, you know, kind of diving into our slate, and we've looked at I think 14 or 15 movies now, was that, you know, the biggest epiphany we had was this kid agency kind of idea, like in a lot of these what we call Slimehouse movies that are not just Nickelodeon movies, you know, they can be kind of any movies from this era. Was that kids drive the narrative, and you know that they're the smartest ones in the movie. So it's cool to hear you guys say that you noticed that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the movies like I go back to E.T. or The Explorers, or even, you know, if you want to get darker, a miniseries like It and the book It, right? Like the parents are either awful or the parents just don't exist, right? Like they and that's really, I mean, I know that's how our childhood, like I remember one time when Scott and I think it was the year after 7th grade or 8th grade, Scott, I think it might have been after 8th grade, like I went and visited, and Scott had like his leg was broken, and we were like going and like we were going to see the new mall like being set up, right? And it didn't exist there yet. It was the Woodlands Mall. And I remember we took a shortcut to get on these train tracks, and we heard a train starting to come, and we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So it's like, we're like trying to run, and it felt a lot like Stand By Me.
Yeah.
Right. Which is another example, right? Where it's like, you just see Scott, like kind of like, you know, like just going really fast, like hobbling. And we're like, we got to go, you know? And that's the truth, is that like, you don't know what you don't know whenever you're a kid. And the rules are different. Once parents leave, everything goes out the window, and there's like this different type of like little environment, you know, which is strange, you know, that's like the playground or wherever you were became the Wild West. And I think that Nickelodeon, and you know, I love the idea of like the Slimehouse, like a callback to like Splatterhouse or Grindhouse films, or you know, like
Yep.
that makes total sense to me, you know, is that that's what it is, you know, like you look at Blank Check or First Kid or any of these movies, you know, it's like it's the kid just in control, and there's always like a parent that's trying to like, you know, like take them down a peg, and the parents never win, right? Ever. License to Drive is a good example also. Like I love License to Drive, and I mean, look at the Lost Boys. It's all the same, right? Like the rules are different, and there are these like tiers. So yeah, agency is huge, and I think that that's why we hold them so near and dear to our hearts.
Yeah, one of the first movies we covered was Weird Science, which we actually call proto slime very lovingly, as kind of like a precursor to kind of the golden age era, and a lot of those kind of 80s, you know, that transition from like the popular like teen sex comedy into the more like Goonies style movie. We very lovingly call that the proto slime era. But Weird Science was a good one. None of us had ever seen it, so it was a good one to kind of see. Oh wow, this is like a lot of these tropes and narrative kind of patterns in their infancy almost.
Anthony Michael Hall's awesome. Like he's so good in it, and he's good now. I can't wait to see him whenever he's going to be in the new Halloween Kills next year.
Oh yeah.
I guess my last question I have, and these guys might have more too, but it's interesting because I was thinking as I was watching it about an hour in, I was thinking, what's going to be the end? You know, what are they going to do? And I realized your ending was really well written in the sense that you describe how Nickelodeon bloomed into something much more corporate, and you had SpongeBob and Dora come along and really ballooned it into something else, but also the creator no longer being there, and so sort of her tenure ending being a natural place to go. But I'm interested because the era I grew up watching Nickelodeon was like just on the end of this quote golden age, you know, and I didn't know what era I was in or whatever, but I was watching stuff like Hey Arnold, which isn't covered a whole lot in the doc, and the Wild Thornberrys and Rocket Power and Ginger and all these things, and Rugrats for sure. But Rugrats was sort of like the torchbearer for the next wave of Nickelodeon. So my question is just sort of, what do you make of that sort of that next wave, pre-SpongeBob, pre-Dora, but like that second wave, and sort of that has not yet been covered in a documentary in any fashion.
I mean, I think that era is awesome. You know, I really do. And that was one of the things that once we focused up on Geraldine Laybourne's tenure, it gave us a good starting and ending point. And that was were there shows afterward that we wanted to cover? Yeah, absolutely. You know, Invader Zim, that's one that I just adore. I think that's a fantastic show. Hey Arnold, fantastic show. So it was just kind of like we were telling essentially her story. So when she left, that's when we ended it. But I think that Nickelodeon continued to do amazing things. I mean, SpongeBob is a fantastic show, and that's kind of where we ended it. But SpongeBob was created with the same passion and originality that Rugrats, Doug, and Ren and Stimpy were. It just, for whatever reason, the stars aligned, and that one became way, way, way bigger than any of its parent Nicktoons. But yeah, I mean, I think Nickelodeon did that era is great. And that way, you know, when people say, oh, it's about the golden era, it's like, that's not really what we're trying to say, because the golden era is different for everybody. We ran into some people that said what we were considering the golden era was too late. And by 85, Nickelodeon sucked, you know? So like, wow. So that's really what we're careful to say is we're talking about whenever it first became what it was to the moment it was a bona fide juggernaut. And that was with SpongeBob SquarePants. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, Geraldine Laybourne leaving.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that we would have been happy to go on and do more, right? Like, it's just like you said, for this we needed to find a definitive ending. But you know, the next generation, even Dora the Explorer, the first screenwriting class that I took, they said that the two films or stories that you should try to really emulate when you think about it are A New Hope, Star Wars: A New Hope, because they have all the tropes, right? Like the wise old wizard, the idealistic farm boy, the princess, the big bad, and then Dora the Explorer, because they're very clear, and they know what the beginning is, they know what the middle is, and they know what the resolution is, right? And if you can't do all three of those, then your story is going to be a mess, right? And it's very important to understand that in terms of pacing. And so you're right, you know, like the Wild Thornberries, Angry Beavers, like, I mean, you could just go down the list, and anybody that, if they were to come up to that generation or the generation now that's watching Nickelodeon, anybody that if they were to say, I think that this is the best, they would they would be right. One, because it's their opinion. Two, because it's all amazing. All of it is, right? This isn't like the Star Wars, you know, the 9 films where we probably all could sit down and go, okay, well, maybe that one was a miss. We can agree on that one, right? But yeah, I think that there's room to explore that, and you know, fingers crossed, if the stars were to align, we would explore it in the future also, because those stories need to be told.
Awesome. Very cool.
I think that's a great note to end on. Feels good to me.
Yeah.
Feels good to me. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, guys. This was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much. This is great.
Cool. Yeah. Sounds good. All right. We'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a great Friday.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.